So today we find ourselves in Mark 6. Last week we talked about Mark 5. Funny how that works. Look what they gave me this week. I can change the slides. Before we get into Mark 6, I'm gonna tell you a little story. So when I was in Africa last year in Mayotte, one of the men I spent a lot of time with was this guy right here. His name is Baba Sula. Baba means father, and Sula was his son's name. When you could become a father in Mayotte, you adopt their names. So this picture always makes me laugh because it's probably the only time that I've ever seen him not with a smile on his face. It's just the one time we took a picture and he wasn't smiling. But the thing about Baba Sula is throughout the last 10 years, we've had missionaries in deep relationship with him. And he's been one of the only people who shared his openness and was actually keen on understanding and learning about the gospel. But the thing with him is he never actually got there. He never actually, by the time that all of the missionaries have left now, he never made a commitment to Christ. And this can leave missionaries, especially if they've been there for more than 10 years, feeling like a failure. And that's a feeling that has plagued us as missionaries in Mayotte for however long that we've been there, is this idea of failure. So as we jump in, let's keep that in mind. If you're a visual learner, you're in luck today. So I've broken down Mark 6 into 2 large sections and 5 subsections. And we're going to take a look at each of the 5 and learn a little bit about them. So the first section I have titled Sending in the Middle of Failure. And the second section I have called Jesus' Power. So let's look at the first section, A Prophet Without Honor. I hope you can read that up there. The key verses 4 to 6. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, in his own home. He could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Now there's a lot to unpack, but a few key things about this verse is when we look at Jesus going to his hometown in Nazareth. Firstly, Nazareth was a very small town. When Jesus came home, everyone knew who he was. They grew up with him. They probably saw him playing on the street corner. They knew he was a carpenter, not a rabbi. That's why they exclaimed, "Isn't this the carpenter?" Thirdly, they called him the son of his mother, which in the ancient Jewish culture was actually a deep insult. If you did not call him the son of his father, as that would have been a sign of honor, no, they called him the son of, "Isn't this Mary's son?" So they took a great offense to him because they thought he was a carpenter. He had no rightful place to be saying all of these things. But lastly is probably the greatest question that, when I read it, I thought, what is going on? Because Jesus can't perform miracles. Why can't Jesus perform miracles? That should be our first question that we find ourselves having when we read that. Because normally we see Jesus as this high and mighty figure, right? He's divine, he's fully divine, he's omnipotent, he has all this power. But why can't he perform miracles? If you look at my second point, it's the classical view of Christology versus the kenotic view of Christology. And Christology is basically what we believe about Christ, about Jesus, what we believe about him. And the classical view would say he is 100% human and 100% divine. And the kenotic view would state that Jesus gave up his divineness, his omnipotence, while he was on earth to fully enter into a human form. Now, I'm not sure myself what I believe. I would normally lean towards the classical view, but proponents of the kenotic view would state that this shows that Jesus wasn't actually fully powerful because he couldn't fully do all these miracles. But in my opinion, that's actually a misreading of the text. What the central point of this is trying to say is trying to focus on the unbelief of the townspeople and not that Jesus was rendered powerless. It's to focus on the people who did not have faith. Because if people do not have faith, it puts an insurmountable barrier between them and God. But as Christians, we do believe that God can surmount insurmountable barriers. Amen? Yeah, that's exciting, but that's how we should read this text. It is also interesting here that Jesus never enters a synagogue again after this text. in chapter 6. He's got the rest of Mark's gospel. He never enters the synagogue. He changes his focus from the teachers of the law onto the people, to the marginalized. Let's move on. Jesus sends the 12, verse 6 to 13. It is interesting to see that this comes immediately after Jesus' apparent failure. But what's important, in verse 7, we see calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. Firstly, 2 by 2 in Jewish law, you needed 2 people to create accountability. It would not be an accountable testimony if there was not someone to back it up. So that's why that's there. The 12 disciples represents the reconstituted people of Israel. The purpose of Israel was to bless the whole world. So Jesus gathering 12 people and sending them out 2 by 2 is not just a random coincidence. He meant to do that on purpose. But the way he sends them out is also very interesting. He has a very interesting missiology, the way he sends out people to mission. When you sent me to Africa, you sent me with money, with immunizations, with bags, with clothes. But what does Jesus say to do? He says, take nothing for your journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Could you imagine sending me with nothing? I don't think my mother would appreciate that. But this is interesting because that's the way Jesus calls us to do it. He commands us to have faith. It's interesting. Another interesting aspect is the disciples were charged to judge the people that they were encountering by their hospitality. Not by the way they were acting, not by their piety, not by their holiness, but by their hospitality, how they were to welcome them. Imagine if that was our focus. Hospitality. This is also the first sending of the disciples, but it will not be the last. We see after the death and resurrection that they are sent out again. Sending, calling, mission is not only a one-time occurrence in our own lives. It can happen more than once. The third section is John the Baptist being beheaded. One of the most strange, and if you've read this, you're probably wondering why. But one important aspect is that this is actually a flashback. This is not happening chronologically. Mark includes this here for a reason. When we read this, we have to pay attention to the fact that when he wrote this on parchment 2,000 years ago, that he meant to put it here for a reason. So we should ask why. Well, we know it's a flashback because earlier in Mark, John was put into prison, and in the ancient world, when you were put in prison, that meant you were going to die. It was not a comfy place that you enjoyed being, where you got meals. No, you went there to die. This is just the story of how. Mark includes this because there was a common misconception at the time that Jesus was actually John the Baptist resurrected. And he submits this long passage because he needs to provide accountability for why. Jesus is not John the Baptist. It's interesting, as we see John the Baptist's death, we assume that John lost. But in his death, actually, John wins. And Herod loses as this idea of a king, a Jewish king, becomes forever a symbol of wickedness and excess. And this is crucial to why Mark inserted this here, because later we see Jesus take back that title of a Jewish king and changing it from wickedness to excess. This is important. As we look at this first section, we have to ask ourselves why this matters. Why does Mark sandwich a story of sending between 2 stories of apparent failure on the surface? This is important as when we look at our own lives and as we look at how God calls us, oftentimes we tend to focus on our failure and believe that our failure inhibits something that God can do. But that's just wrong, as Jesus shows here. Our mission as Christians will involve this failure, will involve opposition from people in the world. And even though we have privilege here in Canada, as Christians. We don't face persecution as John did. Or at home, we might not find that people hate us because we are carpenters. We still must expect opposition. We still must expect that these things could and probably will happen to us. Let's move to the second section. Jesus feeds the 5,000. The key verse here in verse 42 is they all ate and were satisfied. Now the Greek word, Dylan will probably laugh at me because he's in Greek class, but it's Thiessen, which means satisfied. And if you think back to the ancient world, satisfied, this word does not get used very often. How often do they get to eat as much as they possibly want? That does not happen, or it did not happen very often. So the fact that Mark includes that here only exemplifies this incredible miracle. This miracle that Jesus does is alluded to being like Moses in the Old Testament, who provides manna for the Israelites. Also, he's alluded to being like a shepherd, a common Hebrew phrase that guides people, that shepherds people into a better understanding, a better life. This is also immediately following the idea of the corrupt king of Herod. We see this idea of Jesus, the rightful king, the provider, and everything that Jesus actually accomplishes. God's provision for people in the Bible normally is symbolized with food. As our basic necessity, we often find that as, well, we find it plentiful here. We do not find we often are in much need. But in the Bible, that is something that always is symbolized with God's provision, with God taking care of our needs. But even though we do not see it purely in food, we can see it in other ways, whether that be spiritual provision, mental health, relational provision, stewardship, our relationship with the earth. God provides these things. But however God provides these things, it does not mean that we will not go through hard times, but rather that when we do, God will bring good out of that and provide for our needs in incredible ways. When I drive to school, there's a church that I drive by, and it always has a sign with different things. Normally the sign actually triggers me because I don't agree with it. But this week, they put something that actually that struck me, and it ties into what I've been saying. So they said that faith does not make all things easy. It makes all things possible. Faith does not make all things easy. It makes all things possible. We should sit with that. This next section, or this last section, Jesus walks on the sea. It's significant for many reasons, but as we look at the key verse, 51, 52, then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Could you imagine being the 12 disciples, just witnessing Jesus feed 5,000 people, and not believe that he could do this? It's also remarkable that Jesus climbs into the boat with them. What a perfect picture of what Jesus does with us. He climbs into our boat. But we should not see this boat in the middle of the sea as another random picture. It meant something. In the ancient world, the sea, the ocean, was an idea of chaos, was a picture of chaos. In the ancient world, a God worth worshiping was a God that could bring order to chaos. So we see Jesus walking on water, and in other parts of the Gospels, we see Jesus calming the waves. We see Jesus conquering the chaos. And it's interesting, as we just saw in the first section, where we apparently have this doubt of Jesus' divineness, and at the end we see his absolute power, and we see his absolute divineness. This is a beautiful picture of the incarnation of God and humanity coming together. There's no better picture than this, the both aspects of it. But when we look at the disciples and we look at their doubt, it's quite easy to judge them. For they just witnessed that Jesus used his power to feed 5,000 people with no food. But then they think he's a ghost. John Calvin said that it showed an extraordinary stupidity on their part, especially as they had just witnessed his miracles. How easy is it to say that they were stupid? Yet how often do we think Jesus is a ghost in our own lives? It's so easy. It's so easy to do that. We too will pass through those tests like the disciples, like we see Jesus conquering the waves, walking on water. I'm sure some of us have had those moments, have had God providing, but we face these tests nonetheless. The question is, however, will we be victorious in the tests that we have in front of us? Or will we fail like the disciples here? It is clear that the disciples struggled with this aspect of faith, even though Jesus makes it clear that it is contingent with this idea of failure. I love at the first section, the first three subsections, we are faced with this apparent failure in the middle of sending. And then we get hit with Jesus' power, his divineness, his ability to conquer all of our failures. And then when we reflect on this actuality, we see that they weren't actually failures at all. The first section accomplished something. The third section accomplished something. It is interesting that our idea of failure is often different than God's. When we think back to my story about Baba Sula, the man that I knew in Mayat, we often think back, and I often have reflected and seen my time with him as a failure. We never actually got anywhere with him. We couldn't have tangible material results that I could come back and show, look at all these amazing things that we did. Objectively, from our point of view, it was a failure. But when we think about it, how could 10 years of showing Christ's love to him possibly be a failure? Right? From God's point of view, how could that possibly be a failure? He's still controlling that situation. But when we look at my day-to-day, and when I look at my day-to-day, I often see things that I've done as failures. But how often, and this is something that I need to work on too, is God not see it as a failure? We must trust in the authority of Jesus and the power of Jesus that we can look to, that we saw in the last two sections, and especially in the story of Jesus conquering the sea. How many times have we thought that we have failed? God's marker of failure is commonly different than ours, and we need to take that with us. I implore you to. So as we finish and as I close in prayer, take that with you, reflect on that, and if you want to talk to me about it, I would love to talk to you about it.